Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet ministers have been meeting in Winnipeg this week. They're charting a course for where they want to take their minority government in the next few months to find out where things are at with some of the issues that matter to Indigenous people. APTN brought in a panel of ministers. Here is Crown-Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett, Indigenous Services Minister Marc, Northern Affairs Minister Vandal, and Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice to have 4 ministers sitting at the desk here. It's usually just Dennis Ward and I. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that matter, as we said, to Indigenous people. I'll start with you. Just the headline grabber right now is the conflict at Wet'suwet'en Nation. We've got hereditary chiefs and their supporters opposed to a pipeline going through their territory. You've got elected chief and council. Where do you stand on this? What's your position on it?
Well, I think it does speak to really how we want to go forward in the progress on self-determination, how we want communities to be able to determine their governance and determine how they as communities will take decisions. And so, I think that we still hope that the community will be able to find a way forward, and we're very supportive of that process where communities will be able to take decisions, and in this case, of course, the elected chiefs and council had supported the project through all of its due process, and therefore this is, it's unsettling, but it is. I think we hope the community will be able to
do you think
come to a decision.
It's something that the community has to sort out amongst itself, and that there's no role for the court to be issuing injunctions in this?
Well, I think that this is a process that, in terms of the British Columbia government, a process that has been followed, and I think that and followed with the elected chiefs and councils. But it is about obviously there now is some members of the community who don't agree, and so we've got to figure out what you do when that happens. And I think it's going to be the community that has to be able to help chart a path forward, but it is about a BC process that was followed properly.
Okay. Mr. Miller, I want to talk to you about the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, children who were victimized by the child welfare system over a long course of time here in Canada. When are you guys going to sit down and meet with all parties who are involved in this?
Well, that's an excellent question, and currently the parties are meeting, and this is why I've asked my Assistant Deputy Minister Valerie Demont to engage in a process to move forward and engage with the parties to see what the best process is for an adequate and fair compensation for children who have seen an incredible amount of victimization and harm occur to them. We are, as a government, do not contest compensation. We just want compensation to be effected in a fair and equitable way. Out of fairness to the process, and this is something that I've engaged as a minister with the Caring Society, with AFN, and the parties that we are negotiating with and discussing the issues with, including the class action parties, I've agreed to be confidential as to the back and forth of the discussions. These are very sensitive discussions. These are very painful discussions, but they need to be had, and they hadn't been had up until now. We face some deadlines, but we're focused on ensuring at all times that the children that were hurt are fairly and properly compensated.
Perfect. Mr. Vandal, yes. You have Northern Affairs. This is the first time it's a standalone portfolio, I do believe. That's right. You've got a housing shortage. I think Nunavut needs $1.8 billion just to catch up. Yes. You've got a suicide crisis. Suicide rates are higher in the north than anywhere else. You've got food insecurity. You've got critics of a federal government food system that people say it's not working as it should. Where do you start with all of this?
It's an excellent question. Excuse me. And I think our government realizes that all those questions are so very important, and which is why we've created the first ever Minister of Northern Affairs, which I'm fortunate to have. And I think what we need to do, first of all, and I've already started this last week, is actually go up there and talk to the people who live in those communities. Last week I went to Whitehorse, I went to Yellowknife, I was in Churchill. I spoke with chiefs, I spoke with community leaders, I had dinner with Premier Premier Cochrane, met with Premier Silver, and some really good meetings. And all of those issues are so very important. Housing, climate change. Climate change is occurring 3 times faster in the north than it does in the south. So it's really the context underlying everything. If you see the infrastructure, the permafrost is melting. The infrastructure is the foundations of buildings, of houses are buckling, which is a
But how do you possibly
issue.
look at all of these things and
Well,
have a plan to
I do it,
these are all
obviously,
massive issues alone.
I'm going to work with a whole bunch of other ministers, Minister Bennett for one, on Inuit Nunangat policy, Minister of Infrastructure, Minister of Transportation, and we need a whole of government approach. That's apparent. It's not one minister that's going to make progress on all of these issues. Housing is a tremendously important issue. I've already met with Minister Hussein on possible solutions, working together. So we need a whole of government approach, and that's going to be my direction moving forward. There's already been a lot of good work done with the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, which Minister Bennett led, which was co-developed with Indigenous nations, with provinces, with territories. Now the challenge is going to be to go from co-development to co-implementation. And that's really what I want to do, build on the work that's been done and the commitments that have been made, and bring it to life. All of those issues are incredibly important. That's why I'm here as Minister of Northern Affairs, first ever, but we need a whole of government approach to move forward on all of those issues we've talked about.
Minister Guilbeault, funding for Bill C-91. When are we going to know what the money is going to look like for the Indigenous languages?
Before I answer that, and I will, I'd just like to come back on something Dan just said, which is the fact that for our government, Indigenous issues is not the responsibility of 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 ministers, but it's a cabinet responsibility. Everybody is part of this. It's in everybody's mandate letter. There are only 2 things that are part of everybody's mandate letter: Indigenous issues and climate change. Because climate change shouldn't be just about the environment minister. It's a government responsibility. Big issues to tackle, a number of things that Dan has said, and some of the questions you were asking.
So what's your role in this? Obviously languages would be one. What's another? What are some of your other roles in this?
Well, I think we need to look at languages as something so much more than just languages. It's about culture. It's about heritage in a very broad sense. It's about who we are, how we tell our stories to each other, how we dream of the future together. And the Indigenous Language Act is groundbreaking in the sense that without the implication of Indigenous people, this act would simply not exist. It was only made possible because of the heavy involvement of the Métis people, First Nations, and Inuit. It was adopted on the last day of Parliament in June of 2019. So we are looking at how we are going to implement this, and we want to do it very quickly. One of the first things we need to do is to put together a commissioner's bureau for the Act, and we are actively working with our partners, Indigenous partners, to make this happen in the shortest possible amount of time.
Is there a dollar value that we can look for in the next budget?
Well, we've already committed more than $350 million for the implementation of the Act and adequate ongoing funding afterwards. Now, what's the dollar figure on that? I can't tell you right now because the different Indigenous languages are in a very different state. So we have to figure out what is adequate for one community may not be for another. And one of the things we will be doing in the coming years is to figure that out. But it's in the law. We've put it in the law that we have to provide adequate funding. We decided that this is an obligation that we were putting on the federal government, and we want to deliver on it.
Minister Ben, I'll come back to you. There's some forward movement on Indian Day School compensation. Your government has said there's 700 schools that survivors of those schools will be compensated for. There's another 680 schools that were excluded from this. What do you say to the people who say you guys are only helping half of the victims of day schools?
So we're very pleased, and of course being here in Winnipeg, we can't help but think of Gary McLean and his amazing smile and who sort of led this process, who of the people who came together and decided they didn't want to go to court. They wanted to sit down with the federal government and determine what was fair. And so of that group, I think we've done well, and we're I think breaking new ground in terms of the way we can work together.
But that's only half of the day school survivors.
So I think that the issue is that we are committed to do the right thing, to have justice for anyone who was harmed by these failed federal policies in the past.
So there is something for those other survivors of the 680
I think that
schools?
We've been working very hard with Île La Crosse. That was a day school that was mainly for Métis. It was run by the province, but we actually have Saskatchewan. But we actually are working with those survivors to see what they need and how we can move forward on that, hopefully with the province of Saskatchewan. But again, each of the schools has a different story. But we started with the first apology the Prime Minister gave was for Anderson, for a school that was founded before Newfoundland and Labrador were even in Canada. So I think our track record is about doing the right thing, and that we're going to keep working with all survivors and families to get this done.
So there's hope for those 680 other schools that the conversation will continue.
I think that we are we're 99% through the Indian residential schools settlement, and we're going to just keep working on anybody who was harmed.
Okay. Minister Vandal, there was a big drop in support for your party between 2015 and 2019 with First Nations people and Inuit people in particular. Is there conversations at your party level about how to regain that trust?
There was, but at the same time, I'm very proud of the work we've done since 2015. If you look at how much was invested in 2015 to how much now, there was over $21 billion of new money that was invested in education, in healthcare, in boil water advisories. In Manitoba alone, there was over $1 billion invested in northern Manitoba. I know there's four new schools that were funding was found for northeast of Norway House, which means over 1,600 students will no longer have to leave their communities to go to high school, and that's incredibly important. $100 million for a new health facility in Norway House, which is so needed up there, as well as agreements with MKO and on health transformation. I believe that was $42 million, and great work with the Métis Federation, Métis National Council, including the MMF here.
Yeah, so the Métis were backing you guys in this election for sure, but it didn't seem like the votes translated for First Nations and Inuit people. So is there a disconnect between the financial investment and people not seeing that as money that's meaningful in some way? Like, I just want to know what the conversation was that you guys have after the 2019 election.
It's hard to control the politics, and of course I think we're going to continue to do the right thing by communities, community by community, nation by nation. And I think that's really what's needed. And we need investment, as was done in the first term, for the next 20 years to just close those socioeconomic gaps. And that's the right thing to do. And we're going to do it in partnership with First Nations, with Métis and with Inuit. And how the politics are going to how it's going to move. It's something that, I don't want to say it's beyond our control, but it's fluid, it's dynamic. You've got other parties that are saying we're not doing enough, and we know we're not doing enough, but we've made some great progress on some very important key issues. We're trying to close the gaps that are out there, and we're going to do the right thing in partnership, and that's very important. Co-development is something that was never heard of before 2015, whether it was the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, or the Child Welfare Bill, or the Languages Bill. Those were important initiatives that were co-developed. So I think we have to continue doing the right thing and let the politics evolve.
Just fall where they may. Votes fall where they may, I guess. Minister Guilbeault, I wanted to ask you about, prior to getting into politics here and the current role that you are as the Heritage Minister, you have spent a lot of time as a climate activist, somebody who worked on climate policy. I'm curious just as to your personal, if you look around now, do you feel that Canadians are getting this, that climate change is real and what each individual person who lives here, the impact that we're having on this planet? I mean, you've worked for years in this as your background. Are you seeing an evolution? Is it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I started working on climate change in the early 90s, and when we talked about climate change in those days, people said that we were, out to lunch, alarmist. People called us a green melon. We were a watermelon. We were green on the outside, red on the inside. We were communists disguised as environmentalists. That's what people thought of people that were talking about climate change in those days. We don't hear that anymore. There's been an evolution in the mentality of Canadians by and large. Not everybody, obviously, but in the last election, 70% of Canadians voted for parties that had more than 70%. For parties that had very strong climate change policies. We between those four parties, we don't agree on everything, but we all agree we must do more to fight climate change. We must do more for better housing and more efficient housing, more transit, more electrification, getting communities off diesel. So there's been tremendous progress, but we have a long way to go before this problem is solved. And we are seeing all around the world that the problem may be accelerating much more so than what scientists I was talking to 20 years or 10 years or 5 years ago were saying.
Minister Miller, C-92, lots of uncertainty around how this is going to roll out. There's been criticism or confusion, I guess. What's the funding going to look like? What's the plan for jurisdiction? What can you offer to people who are scratching their heads? This came into effect January 1st, and there's still a lot of people going, I don't know what's happening.
Oh, look, first I want to loop the loop on something really important that Stephen said about education. Sure. The core of my mandate is to close those socioeconomic gaps, and we did that with respect to education, and a core part of that is languages and culture. As part of closing that financial gap, which we've done, there's $1,500 per student on reserve allocated to language and culture, which is so key in those formative years, K to 12, to achieve, and we've done that. And the outcomes will come. We know that when we dedicate that money and those resources in the right way, we enable the discussions about self-determination. And we know that the results are there with various examples. Non-Indigenous students, the graduation of Indigenous student rates are the same, if not higher, than non-Indigenous graduation rates when control is put back into community. And that is so important, and it enables all the discussions that we're having today here on self-determination. An integral part of that, which a lot of us take for granted, is control, care, and custody over your own children. Yeah. Something that has not been, something that Indigenous peoples have not had. When we talk about children, the horrible stories about children being ripped away from their families, and they're occurring today. C-92 was community-driven, and what it does on January 1st is enable a national standard on the best interests of the child. Culturally sensitive, culturally appropriate, a reflective position as to what you do if you come to that inevitable point where you have to remove a child. We obviously want to focus on prevention, but we can't have this discussion without first having a very important national standard as to the best interests of the child, and then a community-driven process where communities can approach us on a distinctions base and say, hey, I want to draw down on my inherent right to have control and custody over my children, and have a piece of legislation that guides that. So there's a two-stage process to this. First, January 1st is this important standard, and second, the ability of communities to engage with us and talk about the legislations that they choose and the capacity they need in order to take control and custody over children that have been taken away from them. That will require money, and these are discussions that are ongoing with respect to budget asks, but this will be rolled over many years, and this is not a solution that is going to go away quickly, but we as a government and Canadians should be laser focused on this. We should all be thinking of this in the way we see ourselves in our country. We need to move forward in a fashion that is open and respectful and driven by communities, and that's what I've told directly to my officials as we roll out technical guides, as we engage with communities, and we see the plans that they put forward and they choose. Okay. And so the resources will be asked and demanded by communities, and we will have a discussion which includes provinces and fleshed out coordination agreements so children aren't falling through the gaps as they have through the decades before.
Well, I thank you guys all for stopping in at our lovely studio. It's great to have 4 ministers sitting here, and you guys are heading back home, back to Ottawa pretty quick there.
Caucus tomorrow.
Well, thank you, and I hope that your 3-day stay in Winnipeg was enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Good to be home, yes.
Great to be home. Okay.